There are mornings in St. Mary Mead when the wisteria trembles with a sweetness that almost hides the whispers beneath it. Behind lace curtains and polished teacups, guilt and grace often share the same parlour, and in one quiet lane, a secret long buried is about to stir once more beneath the calm of English respectability. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us step together into the affair at Wisteria Lane, where forgiveness blooms, but never without a shadow. It was one of those mild, well-behaved afternoons in St. Mary Mead, when the sunlight, falling through lace curtains, seemed to approve of everything it touched. Miss Marple, comfortably settled with her teapot and a plate of thinly sliced sponge, looked up as Mrs. Weatherby was shown in, a little flustered, pink-cheeked, and carrying, as always, an air of importance tinged with sympathy. "My dear Miss Marple," she began, lowering herself into the chair opposite, "I simply had to come and tell you. There is the most extraordinary business at number 4. My new tenant, Mrs. Linton, you know, and the whole lane is talking of nothing else." Miss Marple poured the tea with a steady hand, murmuring something polite about the weather. It was her way to let others arrive at their subject without interruption. Mrs. Weatherby obliged with pleasure. She's a widow, poor thing, quite alone, and nervous to a fault. They say she has trouble sleeping, but lately she has taken to imagining noises. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice on the word, leaning forward confidentially. Footsteps, voices in the attic, even, can you believe it, a whispering through the chimney. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes bright with mild interest. So she is imaginative, perhaps. "Imaginative?" cried Mrs. Weatherby. "My dear, she's positively unsettling the whole lane." And as the teacups chimed softly between them, a small wind rustled the curtains, as though the afternoon itself had paused to listen. The following week Mrs. Weatherby returned. The air in Miss Marple's parlour was fragrant with polish, and the faint scent of hyacinths, while the mantel clock kept its calm domestic ticking. Mrs. Weatherby's tone, however, carried the tremor of fresh scandal. "She's quite a delicate little thing," she began, stirring her tea, though she had already added sugar. "Pretty, in a washed-out sort of way, and so very polite, always apologising for something she hasn't done. But I must say, Miss Marple, there is something not quite natural about her manner." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "In what sense, dear?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "She listens," she said finally. "Listens as though the house itself were speaking, and she told me, quite calmly mind you, that sometimes she hears a man's tread on the stairs, a heavy tread. She insists it's not imagination." Miss Marple, who had heard many varieties of human imagination in her day, asked only, "And what did you say?" "Oh, I told her she must get more air, of course. But she looked at me. And, Miss Marple, for a moment I could have sworn she was frightened of the silence itself." The clock gave a single solemn tick, and the hush that followed seemed almost deliberate. By the next morning, the affair of the haunted cottage had become, as the vicar's wife put it, public property. Miss Marple, selecting apples at the greengrocer's, could hear it murmured from every corner. Mrs. Harcourt, the grocer's wife, an amiable woman whose imagination ran about 10 minutes ahead of fact, was in her element. "Lights, Miss Marple, flickering in the attic when there shouldn't be any. My brother swears he saw them with his own eyes, and footsteps too, though he admits he'd been to the Pig and Whistle that night." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, well, spirits may take many forms," she said gently. There was laughter, a touch embarrassed, but Mrs. Harcourt went on undeterred. "They do say, though, that Mrs. Linton was never quite right after the war. Something about her husband, shot, or missing, or both. The stories differ." Miss Marple thanked her for the apples and moved on, her mind already assembling quiet pieces of the puzzle, not of ghosts, but of human pain and what people choose to remember. It was a foggy evening when Mrs. Weatherby's nerves finally gave way to curiosity. Returning from the vicarage, she paused at the corner where Wisteria Lane turned into mist and shadow. The air was heavy with damp earth and lilac, and number 4 stood dark against the night, except for a single, flickering glow high in the attic window. For a long moment she watched, half frightened, half fascinated. The light wavered, sank, and then burned more brightly. Not electric, she was sure, but the trembling flame of a candle. She clutched her coat tighter. That attic had been locked for years, ever since the previous tenants had left. The next morning she told Miss Marple everything over tea, her voice hushed and triumphant. "There was a candle, I tell you, plain as day, and the attic shutters were open. Open! What do you make of that, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Perhaps Mrs. Linton has mislaid something," she suggested. "People often go rummaging in old rooms when they cannot find what they're looking for in their hearts." Mrs. Weatherby blinked, uncertain if she was being agreed with or gently reproved. Outside, the wisteria branches trembled in the wind, like thin fingers brushing against glass. A few days later, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Weatherby to return a borrowed gardening book. The drawing-room, bright and over-furnished, bore the usual signs of domestic energy: half-written notes, a vase slightly too full, of daffodils, and on the sideboard a picture frame lying face down. "Oh, that old thing," Mrs. Weatherby said airily when Miss Marple stooped to set it upright. But the glass had slipped in its mount, revealing a second photograph beneath. A man's face, serious and strong-featured, in military uniform. "Your brother, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Mrs. Weatherby flushed. No, that was in the frame when I bought it, I believe." Miss Marple said nothing, though her eyes lingered on the faint inscription visible in the corner. "To E, with all my love." There were, she thought, many kinds of hauntings, and not all required a ghost. That Sunday, the vicar's wife joined Mrs. Weatherby and Miss Marple for tea. The talk inevitably turned to the cottage. "Well," declared Mrs. Weatherby, pouring, "if there are ghosts, I dare say they have every reason. That house has seen sorrow enough for 3 generations." The vicar's wife nodded, but without conviction. "I always think," she said, "that it is living hearts, not dead ones, that disturb a home." Miss Marple, quietly knitting, listened as the theories multiplied. Soldiers' promises, misplaced wills, tragic misunderstandings, all embroidered as naturally as gossip turns into memory. Her needles paused only once when Mrs. Weatherby added, "It must be the attic. It always is, in such tales." Miss Marple looked up, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Perhaps," she said, "though sometimes the attic is only a mirror for the mind." That evening St. Mary Mead seemed to fall under a curious hush. The day's gossip had spent itself, and the air held that particular stillness which comes before the truth begins to stir. From her window, Miss Marple watched the lamps along Wisteria Lane flicker into life, their light trembling on the lilac-coloured dusk. In the distance the cottage at No. 4 stood serenely in shadow, its windows dark, its secrets silent. She set down her knitting and folded her hands. It was not ghosts she thought of, but the softer hauntings of conscience, the memories people cannot bear to look upon, yet cannot quite bury. Somewhere, faintly, a clock struck 9. Miss Marple smiled to herself, the expression both tender and sad. "Ah," she murmured softly, "guilt has its own way of whispering, and it never does so without purpose." And with that quiet thought, the village night deepened, waiting, as only villages can, for the next small revelation to break its peace. It was a mild morning, touched with the promise of sun after rain, and the hedges along Wisteria Lane glittered with droplets like tiny mirrors. The milkman's cart rattled softly as he exchanged cheerful greetings with the postmistress, who stood at the gate sorting envelopes with great self-importance. Their voices carried the easy lilt of gossip, the kind that flourishes best before breakfast. "Ah, it's all the talk. You know," said the postmistress, lowering her voice in mock solemnity. "The ghost at No. 4. Poor Mrs. Linton, and she's such a fragile creature. They say it's the soldier's spirit come back to claim what's his." The milkman laughed, though not entirely easily. "Aye, well, I wouldn't care to be out that way after dark. My cousin swears he saw a light moving up there. White as milk, he says." Miss Marple, kneeling by her rose border, snipped an errant thorn branch and looked up mildly. "Oh, lights can be most deceptive things," she observed, her tone casual, "particularly when people expect to see them." The postmistress gave a little giggle that was not quite natural. "Well, it's a story to tell at any rate." Miss Marple smiled faintly as they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. She bent to gather her clippings, but her mind lingered. Not on spirits, but on the curious satisfaction that fear so often gives to the ordinary. By dusk that evening, the story had already grown a new embellishment. Mrs. Weatherby's maid, a nervous girl with a fondness for sensation, burst into her mistress's parlour just as she was pouring the evening sherry. "Oh, ma'am," the girl exclaimed breathlessly, "I saw it! I truly did! A woman in white standing under the wisteria. All still, she was, as though listening. And then, as the church clock struck 9, she vanished into nothing." Mrs. Weatherby, though trembling herself, tried to maintain composure. "Nonsense, Elsie! You've let that silly gossip get the better of you." But her denial lacked conviction, and by morning she had repeated the story, more calmly but with the same details, to half the lane. Miss Marple heard of it in due course, as such things inevitably reached her. She listened, as she always did, without comment, her knitting lying idle in her lap. It was the girl's phrasing that caught her attention, as though listening. There was, Miss Marple thought, something peculiarly human in that. Ghosts, after all, were not given to curiosity. At the vicarage that evening, over shepherd's pie and treacle pudding, the conversation was inevitably dominated by the haunting. The vicar's wife was briskly dismissive. "People will imagine anything to distract themselves from real duties," she said. "I do not approve of this kind of excitement." The vicar, who had a mild taste for the supernatural, looked thoughtful. "Still, my dear, there are more things in heaven and earth." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yes," she murmured, "though I have found that heaven and earth as a rule are more than sufficient." Laughter followed, but there was an undercurrent of unease. They spoke of footsteps, of sighs heard on the wind, and of a face glimpsed at an upper window. Miss Marple listened, head slightly tilted, her expression kind but distant. She noticed, as she often did, how fear drew people together, made them talk more freely, revealing small vanities and secret sympathies. When the vicar's wife declared that she couldn't bear to live next door to such goings-on, Miss Marple merely smiled and asked, "And yet, dear, isn't it curious how some people rather enjoy the idea of a haunting?" It was not a question that required an answer. The next afternoon was cool and still, the air scented faintly with damp earth and late roses. Miss Marple took her customary walk, her steps slow but purposeful. She passed the church, nodded to the verger, and made her way toward Wisteria Lane. Number 4 stood neat and prim as always, its curtains drawn, its gate freshly painted. Yet there was something in its stillness that felt almost self-conscious, as though the house, too, were listening. Miss Marple paused, drawing her shawl closer. The faintest trace of candle wax lingered on the air, mingled with something else, an older, sharper scent like polish long dried into wood. Her eyes travelled to the gravel path. There, near the side gate, she noticed faint depressions. Footprints, perhaps, but light and uneven, as though someone had lingered there often and half turned back. For a moment, Miss Marple stood quite still. Then she smiled, the small, knowing smile of someone who had long since learned that mysteries are not confined to shadows. As she resumed her walk, her mind turned to the odd way loneliness can disguise itself, even beneath wisteria and lace curtains. 2 days later, Mrs. Weatherby invited a few neighbours for tea, eager to calm nerves, and naturally to discuss them. Mrs. Linton came, pale but composed, her voice soft and courteous. They spoke of gardens, of the shortage of good sugar, of small domestic inconveniences, until Major Denham, a retired officer of genial vanity, began to reminisce about the old regiment. "Ah, yes," he said, stirring his tea, "and old Cartwright. What a fellow he was! Brave as a lion, always laughing. You remember Cartwright, Mrs. Linton? Major Cartwright?" There was a sudden brittle sound, Mrs. Linton's teacup slipping against its saucer. Her hand trembled, and for a moment she looked as if she might faint. I beg your pardon," she murmured. "It was the steam, I think. I felt quite faint." The conversation faltered. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the hearth, watched the colour drain from the woman's face. She said nothing, merely noted the way Mrs. Linton's fingers pressed hard into her lap, as though holding back something long submerged. And when conversation resumed, Polite but uneasy, Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. The past, she knew, has a habit of calling one by name when least expected. By the end of the week, the whole lane was alive again with speculation. Mrs. Pritchard from the corner had heard the ghost herself, a man's voice deep and sorrowful. Mrs. Jennings declared she had seen smoke curling from the attic at dawn. The vicar's wife maintained that these things only thrive when one indulges them. Miss Marple, on her way to post a letter, caught fragments of the talk, embroidered, contradictory, yet all repeated with cheerful assurance. People do enjoy their mysteries, she thought, provided they belong to someone else. Her mind turned, not to the ghosts, but to those who spoke of them. She noted the small evasions in their chatter, the overbright tones, the slight blushes. Fear, she reflected, often serves to conceal guilt. That evening she sat by her window, the twilight soft around her, and wondered how many secrets lay buried beneath the laughter that echoed through the lane. The air smelled faintly of rain and lilac, and something unspoken that lingered longer still. Night descended with the unhurried peace of early summer. From her parlour window, Miss Marple watched the shadows gather beneath the great wisteria, its blossoms pale and heavy in the still air. The lane was quiet now. Only the soft call of an owl broke the hush. Her knitting lay forgotten on her lap. The pattern of the day's events, small gestures, fleeting glances, whispered names, had formed itself slowly, as patterns always did, if one had the patience to see them. She thought of Mrs. Linton, of the fear that lived in her eyes, not of what might come, but of what had already been. The ghost, Miss Marple felt certain, was no restless spirit, but the echo of remorse. The wisteria stirred in a passing wind, its petals brushing against the window-pane with a sound like a sigh. Miss Marple rose, drawing the curtain with gentle finality, her thoughts quiet but unresolved. For guilt, she reflected, is like perfume, faint at first but lingering long after the source has gone. And in the calm of Wisteria Lane, the scent of the past had only just begun to rise. A fine drizzle hung over Wisteria Lane, softening the edges of roofs and hedges until the world appeared wrapped in gauze. Miss Marple stood by the parlour window, her knitting resting on her lap, when a small envelope slipped through the letterbox. The handwriting, neat but uncertain, was unmistakably Mrs. Linton's. It was not a social invitation in the usual sense. The words were courteous, even warm, but there was an odd undertone to them, a nervousness that made the simple offer of tea feel more like an apology than hospitality. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had long known that invitations given out of guilt carry their own weight. When she arrived, the rain had thickened into a whispering mist. Mrs. Linton met her at the gate, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she unlatched it. "It was so kind of you to come," she said, her voice barely rising above the rain. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "it is always pleasant to share a cup of tea on a rainy day." And though the words were simple, Mrs. Linton looked at her as if they carried something larger, perhaps the permission to speak or to remember. The drawing-room of number 4 was immaculately tidy, but not in the way of one who enjoys order, rather of one who fears disorder. The faint scent of lavender hung in the air, mingled with the colder smell of ashes long extinguished. A few photographs stood upon the mantel, carefully arranged yet impersonal, as though chosen more for propriety than sentiment. Miss Marple took her seat beside the hearth. Her experienced eye noted everything. The unlit fire, the polished but unused piano, the clock whose pendulum had stopped midway through its arc. The room had a stillness that seemed less peaceful than waiting. A pause held too long. Mrs. Linton, graceful in her grey cardigan, poured tea with the delicate concentration of one who fears to spill. Her face bore the fragile beauty of a woman too long alone. "It's been years since I've had company," she said softly, almost to herself. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "Then we must make up for lost time," she said, and the words, kind and practical, broke a silence that had hung in the house for far too long. Yet as Mrs. Linton sat opposite her, hands clasped tightly around her cup, Miss Marple could not help but feel that the room, and its owner, were still waiting for someone who would never return. Miss Marple began, as she always did, with the safest of subjects, the garden. Roses, she remarked, had suffered badly after the late frost. Mrs. Linton nodded, her eyes lowering. Yes, the frost spoils everything if it comes uninvited. They spoke of pruning and soil, of wisteria that bloomed too heavily, and of the pests that seemed impervious to remedy. But gradually Miss Marple turned the conversation, as one might guide a stream around a bend toward the subject of the past. Mrs. Linton hesitated before she answered. My husband adored roses, she said, her voice soft. He said they were the only thing in England that stayed honest. They withered when their time came. Miss Marple said nothing, she merely listened. The ticking of the clock, newly wound now, filled the silence. He was an officer, Mrs. Linton continued, her fingers tightening on her teacup. We wrote during the war, but letters are strange things, Miss Marple. They carry love across oceans, and yet sometimes they carry misunderstandings too. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. The loneliness of letters never answered, she said gently, and saw the faint tremor that passed across Mrs. Linton's face, as though a locked door within her memory had been quietly touched. Miss Marple reached for a biscuit, the plate wobbling slightly on the uneven tablecloth. Her eyes by chance fell upon the teacup beside it, a delicate piece of bone china faintly yellowed by age. A hairline crack ran along the handle, mended with silver glue. Beneath the glaze, partly obscured, were the initials E.C. Mrs. Linton noticed her glance and flushed. "Oh, that," she said quickly. "It's very old. I keep meaning to throw it away." "It's quite a pretty pattern," said Miss Marple calmly, turning the cup in her fingers. "Early Edwardian, I should think. A keepsake, perhaps." Mrs. Linton hesitated, then gave a short, brittle laugh. "Something like that. It belonged to someone I used to know, best forgotten." Her tone suggested that forgetting was precisely what she could not do. She refilled Miss Marple's cup with careful precision, though the teaspoon rattled faintly against the china. The gesture, polite as it was, felt like an attempt to smother something, a memory rising, unwanted, to the surface. Miss Marple accepted the tea without comment, but the mended cup lingered in her thoughts. Cracks, she reflected, rarely mend as invisibly as people wish them to. The clock in the hall chimed 4, its sound soft and measured. Mrs. Linton started slightly. Her composure, so carefully maintained, began to waver as she spoke of the war. It was a terrible confusion, she said. Orders sent and cancelled, names crossed out, then rewritten. I sometimes think no one really knew who was safe and who was lost. She smiled faintly, but her hands betrayed her. Tightening, unclenching, tightening again. A mistake was made, you see. A terrible mistake. One of those errors that cannot be corrected once the ink is dry. Miss Marple watched her gently. War does many cruel things, my dear, she said. It tangles duty and affection so hopelessly that one cannot tell which is which. Mrs. Linton nodded, eyes fixed on her cup. Yes, that's it exactly. Her voice trembled. There was a letter, a misunderstanding, and by the time the truth came, it was too late. I've often thought how easily lives may be ruined by one word written in haste. Outside, the drizzle pattered faintly against the windows. Miss Marple said nothing, only waited. But when Mrs. Linton raised her eyes, the expression there was so full of self-reproach that no question seemed necessary. The silence between them held something far weightier than words. Miss Marple took a final sip of tea, her manner as mild as ever. "I wonder," she said, as though remarking upon the weather, "whether your husband ever knew Major Cartwright. He served in the same division, did he not?" For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The spoon Mrs. Linton held clinked sharply against the saucer, a brittle sound that shattered the stillness. Her face drained of colour. "Cartwright?" she repeated faintly. Yes, I believe he did. Why do you ask?" "Oh, only curiosity," Miss Marple replied with an air of innocent reflection. "One hears so many names during those dreadful years." But Mrs. Linton did not answer. Her eyes had fixed on the fire, though it was unlit, and her breathing had grown shallow. A long, uncomfortable silence settled between them, not hostile, but thick with the knowledge of something unsaid. At last she spoke, her voice scarcely audible. "There are some names," she said slowly, that do not fade, no matter how many years pass. Miss Marple inclined her head, her gaze kind but steady. No, indeed, she said softly. They never quite fade, only grow quieter. The clock ticked on, and neither woman spoke again for some time. When at last Miss Marple rose to leave, the rain had begun to ease, a pale wash of light breaking across the lane. Mrs. Linton insisted on seeing her to the door, her politeness automatic but her eyes strangely distant. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice almost steady. "It has been very pleasant." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I dare say it has done you good to talk a little." "Oh yes," said Mrs. Linton quickly. "It's always better to talk." But her hands twisted the edge of her handkerchief until the fabric creased and tore slightly at the seam. Outside, the garden glistened with rain. Miss Marple hesitated on the threshold, then glanced back once more at the parlour, the neat tea things, the polished surfaces, and the solitary cracked cup still standing upon the tray. As she walked home beneath her umbrella, her thoughts lingered on that fragile piece of china, repaired, preserved, but never truly whole. She had seen such things before, objects kept not for love of beauty, but for fear of what their breaking had cost. And as the lane fell quiet again, Miss Marple reflected that the fracture in the cup was no greater than the one in Mrs. Linton's heart, both held together for now by nothing stronger than remembrance. The morning began with a pale, forgiving sun that filtered through lace curtains and fell gently upon St. Mary Mead, softening even the more stubborn imperfections of age. Miss Marple, shawl neatly pinned and gloves buttoned, set out for her customary round of morning calls, an exercise she described as a matter of social duty, though she knew well it was also a matter of quiet curiosity. At each doorway she was met with the fragrance of rose tea, a faint scent of lavender polish, and the peculiar intimacy that small villages reserve for those who have known one another too long to be formal. The talk was cheerful enough, weather, gardens, rheumatism, but beneath the hum of reminiscence ran something quieter, a note just off key. Wisteria Lane, it seemed, had begun to remember. Its people, after long years of silence, had found themselves speaking of the old days at number 4, not with scandal exactly, but with that particular relish reserved for things one would rather not have to believe. As Miss Marple walked on, she felt the whisper of unease pass along the hedges like a draught under a door. Mrs. Pritchard received her with the fuss of one who has been waiting all morning for a visitor. She was a large, florid woman with a kind heart and a memory that preferred the embroidery of time to its bare facts. On the parlour table lay a scrapbook, yellowed and overstuffed, half seed catalogues, half snapshots of faces long vanished. "You remember the Cartwrights, of course," Mrs. Pritchard said, riffling through the pages. "Oh, those were lively days. Officers in and out, garden parties, motor cars in the lane. The master was so handsome, though Mrs. Cartwright never did look quite happy, poor soul." She paused at a faded photograph of a smiling girl in a maid's uniform, hair pinned neatly beneath her cap. "That's Elsie. Sweet thing. Just 17. She simply ran off one spring without a word. Such a pity." Mrs. Cartwright cried for a week, and then, of course, they moved away the following year. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did anyone ever hear from her again?" Mrs. Pritchard shook her head with theatrical sadness. "Not a word. These young girls, once they leave the village, they're gone forever." But Miss Marple, glancing at the photograph, noted the girl's eyes, bright, intelligent, and oddly proud, the kind of eyes that rarely vanish without a trace. At the vicarage the air smelled of beeswax and hymn books. The vicar's wife, a small woman of determined gentility, poured tea with precision and memory in equal measure. "I do recall a funeral about that time," she said thoughtfully. "A small one. No relatives, only the master himself. He looked pale as linen, and though I tried to offer comfort, he would not stay for the hymn. Quite improper, really." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Whose funeral was it, do you recall?" The vicar's wife frowned. "A servant's, I believe. An accident, they said. Something about a fall in the garden. There was talk of sending for the family, but none were ever found." A faint unease passed across Miss Marple's mind, though her expression did not change. "How very sad," she murmured. "Yes," the vicar's wife agreed briskly. "But time passes. It always does. I remember thinking how very swiftly the Cartwrights left afterward. The house was quite empty by autumn. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting toward the churchyard beyond the window. It seemed that the soil of the past was stirring again, and not all the roots were harmless. The churchyard was quiet that afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of moss and late lilac. Miss Marple found old Mr. Rudd leaning on his spade near the yew hedge, his cap pushed back and his eyes squinting against the sun. "Afternoon, miss," he said, doffing his cap. "You've come to look at the graves, I suppose? Folks do now and again." "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple replied kindly. "You used to tend the garden at number 4, did you not?" The old man nodded, his expression wary. "Aye, that I did. Pretty place it was, till the master got it into his head to have me dig under the wisteria. Said he wanted the roots turned over. Never understood it. The ground there was sound enough." He wiped his brow, his voice lowering. "Strangest thing, though, he made me do it after dark with just a lantern. Kept saying it must be done before morning. I remember the smell. The earth all mixed with blossoms. Couldn't get it out of my head for weeks." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You found nothing unusual?" Mr. Rudd shifted his weight uneasily. "Not that I could swear to. But I'll tell you this, miss. I still dream of that patch sometimes. Always the same dream. Digging and someone calling my name from the shadows." She thanked him, her voice gentle though her thoughts turned inward. A patch under the wisteria, dug at night, forgotten by morning. Some roots, she knew, go far deeper than soil. As she walked home, Miss Marple considered the gardener's words. The smell, he had said, had lingered. Sweet, heavy, unnatural. She recalled the vicar's wife's mention of the funeral, and Mrs. Pritchard's story of the vanished maid. Threads, separate yet faintly woven. Later that afternoon, she called briefly at the grocer's, where Mrs. Herring was always willing to contribute her recollections. "Oh yes," she said, "I remember that spring. You could smell the wisteria halfway down the lane. Mrs. Cartwright couldn't abide it. Said it made her faint. Ordered it cut right back the next week. Such a pity. It never flowered the same again." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene but her mind alert. Flowers, she knew, often held memories more faithfully than people. The fragrance that had lingered after the digging, and the sudden order to destroy the plant, seemed less like coincidence than a wish to bury what could not be unseen. And as she stepped back into the afternoon light, she found herself wondering whether the wisteria had hidden beauty or guilt beneath its blossoms. By tea-time the day had grown bright again, and Miss Marple joined Mrs. Weatherby for a cup of strong Assam and the reassurance of familiar gossip. The little parlour smelled of lemon cake and furniture polish, and the conversation flowed easily like a well-trodden footpath. They spoke of Mrs. Linton's nerves, of the weather, of how dreadful it was that people should spread rumours about haunted cottages. But as the name Elsie entered the conversation, that vanished servant girl, a faint hesitation crept into Mrs. Weatherby's tone. She was such a lively little thing, she said, laughing too quickly. Always singing. I dare say she found better prospects somewhere. Girls do. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, though it is curious how some departures are remembered more than others. Mrs. Weatherby coloured slightly and busied herself with the teapot. Well, one mustn't dwell on the past. It does no good. No, Miss Marple agreed softly, and yet the past has such an inconvenient habit of not remaining buried. Mrs. Weatherby glanced up sharply, but Miss Marple's eyes were kind and unreadable. The conversation drifted back to safer ground, but the unspoken name hung between them, like the scent of wisteria through an open window. By twilight, the village had grown still again. Miss Marple sat by her parlour window, the evening knitting resting quietly on her lap. The events of the day arranged themselves in her mind like fragments of a faded tapestry, small domestic details that, when viewed together, began to form a pattern. There were stories of a maid who disappeared, a funeral with no family, a gardener disturbed by his own work, and a woman who could not bear the smell of her own flowers. The pieces fitted almost perfectly. Almost. One question remained, persistent and cold as the dusk creeping across the garden. Why had the roots of the wisteria been disturbed just before the Cartwrights left? Outside, the first stars trembled into view. Miss Marple looked toward the lane where number 4 stood hidden behind its climbing vines. Roots, she murmured softly, will always tell their tale, if one knows how to listen. and with that quiet thought she returned to her knitting, the steady click of needles marking the rhythm of her reflections. Patient, measured, and quietly sure that the truth, like spring, would rise again in its time. The morning began with the sort of noise villagers tolerate with long-suffering patience, the rhythmic thud of hammers, the scrape of shovels, and the occasional murmur of masculine complaint. Renovations had begun again at number 4, where Mrs. Linton, lately recovered from her nerves, had agreed to a bit of tidying in the garden. But just before 11, the hammering stopped. A pause fell, followed by low voices, then a shout, sharp, uncertain. Within minutes the sound carried beyond the hedge. The vicar's maid, taking in the washing, froze mid-peg. Mrs. Weatherby, trimming her roses, stood listening with a hand to her throat. For under the twisted roots of the old wisteria the gardener's spade had struck something that was not earth. It had given a dull, hollow sound, the sort that makes one's heart mislike itself for a moment. A little more scraping, and the curve of bone appeared, small, unmistakable, fragile as porcelain. By the time the local constable arrived, the garden had fallen into an eerie quiet. Only Miss Marple, walking slowly from her gate, seemed unsurprised. Roots, she murmured softly to herself, have a way of remembering what people forget. By noon, Wisteria Lane was no longer quiet. The workmen, standing awkwardly by their spades, had become reluctant heroes in a tale that swelled with each retelling. Curtains fluttered like nervous wings, windows opened and shut without purpose. The postmistress, usually brisk, forgot to weigh the letters. Mrs. Jennings overboiled her pudding, and no one had the presence of mind to notice the church clock striking 12. At the centre of it all sat Miss Marple, her needles clicking with their calm, steady rhythm. She listened without appearing to listen. To Mrs. Weatherby's tremulous horror, to the vicar's wife's moral indignation, to the cautious satisfaction in the voices of those who had always said something was wrong with that house. "Do you think it's a stranger?" asked Mrs. Weatherby breathlessly. Miss Marple's eyes did not leave her knitting. "Oh, no," she said gently. "Things buried under wisteria are rarely strangers." And the lane, which had so lately hummed with gossip, seemed for a brief instant to fall silent again, as though waiting for something it already feared to hear. Inspector Craddock arrived just after luncheon, a familiar figure to those who remembered a certain murder in Gossington Hall some years before. His step was brisk, his tone courteous, his expression carrying that faint weariness particular to policemen who know that human folly travels faster than crime. He greeted Miss Marple with genuine warmth. "Still keeping an eye on things, are you, ma'am?" "Oh dear me, no," said Miss Marple, her voice mild. "One doesn't keep an eye on such matters. They simply come into view, rather like weeds after rain." He smiled, but did not pursue it. His manner with the villagers was polite, but his questions came like neat stitches, tight, economical, leaving little room for embroidery. He asked who had lived in the house before the war, who after, and what work had been done in the garden. When told that Mrs. Linton had recently ordered repairs, his pen paused briefly over his notebook. "I see," he said. "And she has been here how long?" 2 months, Miss Marple replied. His tone was one of professional doubt, as though 2 months were quite long enough for any number of human misjudgments to ripen into consequence. By afternoon, the inspectors and workmen had dug carefully beneath the roots. The discovery, though small, was dreadful in its intimacy. Not only the pale fragments of bone, but a few scraps of decayed fabric, and something glinting faintly beneath the soil. It was an old locket, tarnished yet intact. When prized open, it revealed the photograph of a young woman. Delicate features, a soft smile, and eyes that seemed oddly familiar. Craddock turned it over in his gloved hand. "Initials. E.C., he said. "Mean anything to you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low. "Yes, to anyone who has lived here long enough." He looked at her, half amused, half curious. "It must be the servant girl," she said quietly. "Elsie Cartwright. She went missing in the spring of '41. Craddock whistled softly. "And the photograph?" Miss Marple hesitated. "It bears a striking resemblance to Mrs. Linton, though the years have drawn a veil over it. Perhaps a relative." Craddock's brows rose, but he said nothing. He only slipped the locket into a small evidence envelope and instructed the constable to guard the area. Yet as he turned away, Miss Marple noticed that he held the envelope rather more carefully than usual, as though it contained not just metal and paper, but the echo of a secret waiting to be spoken aloud. Inspector Craddock, persuaded by Mrs. Weatherby's relentless kindness, accepted a cup of tea in her sitting room. The neighbours gathered like moths around a lamp, drawn less by duty than by fascination. Each had a memory to share, a theory to float, a detail that might, under the right light, become significant. Mrs. Jennings insisted that she had once seen the former master carrying something heavy at dusk. The vicar's wife solemnly recalled a funeral without mourners. Mr. Pritchard muttered that he had never liked the look of that gardener. Craddock listened with polite endurance, making the occasional note. Miss Marple, seated near the window, appeared content to count her stitches, yet her eyes, bright and observant, missed nothing. She saw how Mrs. Weatherby grew more talkative whenever guilt was mentioned, how Mrs. Jennings glanced repeatedly toward the lane, and how the vicar's wife, though usually composed, bit her lip whenever the servant's name was uttered. When the inspector rose to leave, Miss Marple folded her knitting and smiled. "You see, Inspector, everyone here tells the truth, just not quite the same truth." He chuckled softly. "And which one would you advise me to believe?" "Oh," said Miss Marple, with the mildest air of surprise. "I shouldn't presume to advise, Inspector, but I find the truth often belongs to the person who speaks least." That evening the constable brought the locket to Mrs. Linton. She stood before the hearth, her face already pale from the day's rumours. When she saw it she reached out, not eagerly, but as one might touch a thing one has dreamt of too often. Her fingers trembled on the clasp. The photograph inside seemed to strike her like a physical blow. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "In the garden, madam," said Craddock, "under the wisteria." A long silence followed. Mrs. Linton's lips moved, though no words came. Then quietly she murmured, "The past. It always comes home, doesn't it?" Miss Marple, standing a little apart, said gently, "Sometimes it only wishes to be acknowledged." Mrs. Linton's eyes flickered toward her, full of something unspoken, fear, perhaps, or relief. She set the locket down carefully upon the mantelpiece and excused herself in a whisper, walking unsteadily toward the next room. The sound of the closing door seemed far too soft for its meaning. Craddock frowned. What was that supposed to mean? Miss Marple looked at the dying embers in the grate. "It means, Inspector," she said quietly, "that the living are not always the ones who need forgiveness." Twilight deepened as they walked together toward the gate. The garden lay hushed, the air faint with the scent of damp earth and the fading wisteria blossoms. Craddock broke the silence first. "We'll send the remains to the county office. Age of bones, clothing fibres, as all that sort of thing. It'll tell us soon enough whether this was murder or mischance." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, murder is rarely a question of chance, Inspector. It's rather like tea. It depends entirely on how one brews it." He gave a short laugh. "You mean you think she's guilty?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that guilt takes many forms. Some people conceal it under denial, some under good works, and some under nerves." They paused by the gate. Beyond it the lane glowed faintly with lamplight, warm and ordinary again, as if no grave had been opened that day. Craddock sighed. "You always see the moral of it, don't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One must, dear Inspector. The facts, after all, only show what happened. It's human nature that explains why." And as she watched him walk away, she thought of the locket, the initials within, and the woman who had touched it as though holding her own heart. A heart cracked, perhaps, but still beating beneath layers of silence. The afternoon sunlight had softened into lamplight by the time Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Weatherby's neat, faintly over-furnished drawing-room. The brass clock ticked with the smug precision of an object that had seen many teas and many confidences, and the air carried that pleasant confusion of scents: warm sponge cake, lavender polish, and something faintly metallic from the silver tray. The little gathering was a familiar one. Mrs. Jennings in her perpetually mauve hat, Mr. Harper, whose spectacles always seemed to slip at the wrong moment, and the vicar's wife, brisk but kind. There was laughter, to be sure, and the reassuring chime of spoons, yet under it all, Like a draught under a closed door, Miss Marple sensed a certain strain. The laughter rang a shade too loudly, the cheer a trifle rehearsed. Mrs. Weatherby poured tea with unnecessary diligence, her hands steady, her voice brighter than usual. "Such a comfort, is it not, to see the lane coming alive again?" she said. Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, my dear, though sometimes life returning disturbs more than it soothes." No one quite answered that, and for a moment only the faint hiss of the kettle filled the silence. As the tea grew cooler and the plates lighter, conversation drifted, as it inevitably did, toward the subject that hung invisibly between them. It began innocently enough, with Mrs. Jennings remarking that she had always found wisteria a plant with too much temperament, and Mr. Harper chuckling that the Cartwright's vine had a mind of its own. But soon each neighbour, prompted by the other's half-remembered musings, began to tell again the story of the Cartwright affair. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like hearing a nursery rhyme retold by 7 different generations, familiar, yet never quite the same. Mrs. Jennings swore the police had searched the garden twice. The vicar's wife corrected her, saying once only, and with great decorum. Mr. Harper remembered Mrs. Cartwright as a tall, commanding lady, while Mrs. Weatherby was sure she had been a small, timid creature. Through it all, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded neatly over her handbag, listening. She noticed how certain names, Elsie, Edward, the gardener, passed too quickly, as though each speaker wished to move on from them. She observed how the tone lightened whenever the conversation neared discomfort, and how each speaker, without meaning to, revealed more by omission than recollection. And as the chatter rose and fell, Miss Marple thought that memory, in a village, is like lace, intricate, charming, and full of deliberate holes. Mrs. Jennings had been quiet for a while, her gloved hands fidgeting in her lap. Then, quite without warning, she spoke, her voice thin, as though the words slipped out before she could stop them. "I remember the night before they left," she said suddenly. "Such a wind there was, and crying. A woman's crying." Her gloved fingers stilled, and she looked around, startled at her own words. "Oh, dear me. Perhaps I dreamt it. I do have such silly dreams." No one contradicted her. The vicar's wife cleared her throat delicately. "You were unwell at that time, I believe?" Yes, that must have been it." Mrs. Jennings gave a nervous little laugh. "I've the most vivid imagination. Quite useless, really." Miss Marple smiled kindly, though her eyes were thoughtful. "Dreams are rather curious things," she said gently. "They have a habit of taking on the shape of what one has refused to remember." Mrs. Jennings flushed. "Oh, you are dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, half laughing, half embarrassed. Yet her hands continued to tremble, and she did not touch her tea again. Mr. Harper, who had been contentedly consuming his 3rd slice of cake, now took it upon himself to restore good humour to the group. "Ah, well," he said jovially, "the Cartwright business was none of my affair. I never knew them well. A fine house, though. I remember admiring the chimney-pots. Always noticed chimney-pots myself." Mrs. Weatherby laughed obligingly. "You must have been very observant." He waved his fork vaguely. "Oh, details, my dear lady, details. One remembers these things. The people, less so." The vicar's wife smiled politely, and Miss Marple, half hidden behind her cup, observed the slight twitch of Mr. Harper's jaw, the faint moisture on his brow. She had seen that expression before, on a man trying very hard not to remember. A few moments later, as he reached for the teapot, he said pleasantly, "More tea, my dear Mrs. Cartwright?" The room fell utterly still. Mrs. Weatherby gasped softly. The vicar's wife coloured faintly, murmuring, "I beg your pardon, Mr. Harper?" He blinked, confused. Oh, dear me, what am I saying? Mrs. Weatherby, of course. Must be all this talk of the past." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Ah, yes, the past has an inconvenient way of slipping through the cracks of the present." Mr. Harper gave a strained laugh, but his hands were clumsy as he replaced his cup, spilling a few drops that darkened the linen like small guilty blots. The conversation wavered after that, each voice now just a little too measured, every laugh an echo of the one before it. Then Mrs. Weatherby, seeking to restore normality, spoke of her cousin's recent holiday in Devon. Someone, it might have been the vicar's wife, mentioned Major Cartwright's regiment, and in the same breath Edward Linton's name was uttered. At that, Mrs. Weatherby's hand froze mid-pour. The stream of tea overflowed the cup and ran soundlessly onto the saucer. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you're spilling." Mrs. Weatherby started, dabbing at the tablecloth. "Oh, how clumsy of me! I was thinking of something someone once said." Her voice faltered. The others waited, politely silent. "It was the night before the Cartwrights went away," she continued slowly. "A neighbour told me she heard a voice, outside in the garden, saying, 'Tell Edward.'" The words hung there, quiet but heavy, and no one seemed inclined to ask what had been meant. Miss Marple's eyes lowered to her lap, though her mind was already moving through names, faces, and connections. Tell Edward. It had the ring of both confession and plea, two things that never sleep long in a village like St. Mary Mead. Conversation resumed, though the air felt changed, as though the room itself had drawn a careful breath. There were fresh smiles, fresh laughter, even a small skirmish about the quality of the scones, but the tone had altered. It was as if the drawing-room had grown aware of its own pretence. Miss Marple leaned back, slightly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The words swam before her in quiet repetition, scraps of old gossip, gentle untruths, polite omissions. They layered over one another like the petals of a fading bloom. It was never one great lie, she thought, merely 1,000 small ones told for comfort, convenience, or fear of embarrassment. They had built their own version of the past, polished and unthreatening, until truth itself became the only unwelcome guest at tea. She glanced around at the smiling faces, at Mrs. Jennings pretending composure, Mr. Harper sipping tea too quickly, Mrs. Weatherby avoiding her gaze. Yes, Miss Marple thought, the truth is not lost here. It has simply learned to wear gloves. When she returned home that evening, dusk had settled over the lane in a soft violet hush. The world felt smaller, more intimate, as if each house along Wisteria Lane were holding its breath. Miss Marple set her knitting neatly aside and opened her little diary. She wrote 3 words: Edward, told, silence. Then she underlined them once gently, as though afraid of bruising their meaning. Outside, the wisteria swayed faintly in the breeze, its blossoms whispering against the window-pane. Miss Marple closed the book, folded her hands and sat quietly, her expression serene. She did not need to think hard. Truth, she knew, would come to her in its own time. It always did, like the faint scent of wisteria returning year after year, no matter how deeply one pruned the roots. The morning light fell softly upon Miss Marple's breakfast tray. A pot of tea, neatly buttered toast, and the St. Mary Mead Gazette folded to an article about the unfortunate discovery in Wisteria Lane. Outside, the air was gentle, the world untroubled, but in Miss Marple's mind a pattern had begun to arrange itself with quiet inevitability. She considered, as she spread her marmalade, how it was so often the smallest things that gave people away. The initials on the teacup found in Mrs. Linton's cupboard, E.C., for Elsie Cartwright, not Edward, as some might have assumed. The whispered, "Tell Edward," spoken years ago on a windblown night, and the faint, inexplicable candlelight that villagers swore they had seen in the window of number 4 long after its former occupants were gone. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. Instead, her thoughts wove their own threads. The story was no longer one of malice or greed, but of love, misjudged, fearful, possessive love, that had turned inward and curdled into tragedy. It was, she thought sadly, the kind of story one encounters too often in life and too seldom understands in time. She folded her napkin, her resolve settled. It was time to walk down to the lane again. There was a final conversation that could no longer be postponed. The sky was a pale, uncertain blue, and the lane seemed unusually still, as though it held its breath in expectation. Miss Marple walked slowly, her stick tapping gently against the cobbles. The familiar cottages appeared both ordinary and strange, their windows reflecting the quiet vigilance of the village, always watching, always remembering. When she reached number 4, she stopped. The house looked almost peaceful now, its garden neatly kept, its paint freshly whitewashed. Yet something in its stillness carried a faint melancholy, as though the walls themselves had absorbed too many unspoken words. The wisteria hung heavy upon the trellis, its blossoms pale and pendulous, scenting the air with sweetness that did not quite conceal the sorrow beneath. As Miss Marple stood there, she noticed a curtain move ever so slightly, the gentlest flutter, like a breath drawn in fear or anticipation. Someone was watching, someone who had waited too long to be found. She inclined her head, just enough to signal understanding, then turned up the path. The faintest tremor of motion inside, a shadow, a pause, told her that the door would soon open. Mrs. Linton greeted her with a small, tremulous smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "how kind of you to call. I was just about to make tea." Miss Marple accepted with a nod and followed her into the parlour. The fire was lit despite the mildness of the day, and the air carried the faint scent of smoke and lavender. Mrs. Linton's hands shook slightly as she arranged the cups. Fine china, though one bore a faint chip at the rim. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost detached, as though she were reciting something long rehearsed. "I thought I had buried it deep enough," she began, "that if I tended the garden and smiled at the neighbours, it would fade away, but it never did." Miss Marple said nothing. Mrs. Linton went on. Elsie was young, foolish perhaps, but kind. Edward, my Edward, admired her more than was proper. I told myself it was harmless, that men sometimes mistake pity for affection. But that night, that dreadful night, I saw them together in the garden. I believed she meant to take him from me. I was blind with anger, with fear too, her voice faltered. It was an accident, I swear. She struggled, slipped, and I did not mean to let her fall. But when she lay there, still, so still, I thought only of him, of the shame, the ruin. I told him she had run away, and he believed me. A tear slid down her cheek. He died believing it. The clock on the mantel ticked softly between them. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The sound of the fire filled the room, a faint crackle of embers consuming themselves. Then Miss Marple asked gently, "And the light, Mrs. Linton? The candle that burned so faithfully by the window?" Mrs. Linton's hands tightened upon her cup. "Yes," she whispered, "that was me. After Edward's death I began to dream of her, of Elsie, standing beneath the wisteria, looking up as though waiting for something. I told myself it was nonsense, a guilty mind's fancy, but still I lit the candle every night and left it at the window, a vigil of sorts. I thought, if she could see it, wherever she was, she might forgive me." Her voice broke. "Every year, when the wisteria blooms again, I light it anew. It is my penance, Miss Marple, for all that I did and all that I hid." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And for all that you loved," she said quietly. Mrs. Linton nodded, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. "I thought love would make it right, but love can be cruel when mixed with pride." Outside, a faint breeze stirred the blossoms against the pane. They rustled softly, as if in answer, a whispering benediction to a confession long delayed. Miss Marple remained still for a while, her gentle eyes upon the weeping woman before her. When she spoke, it was with that particular tenderness that carries more strength than pity. "My dear," she said, "you have borne your punishment for many years already. Remorse is a heavy thing, but it is not the same as justice, and often far more enduring." Mrs. Linton looked up, uncertain. "You mean I should tell them?" "That is for your conscience to decide," Miss Marple replied. "But sometimes, you see, forgiveness must begin within oneself. There are wrongs which cannot be mended by courts or prisons, only by truth, freely spoken." Mrs. Linton's tears came more quietly now, like a rain that has lost its storm. "And if I am not forgiven?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then you must learn to forgive yourself. It is never too late to make peace with the past, though one must have the courage to face it first." She rose, her voice soft. "You have made a beginning today. That is what matters." When Miss Marple left the cottage, the air outside seemed strangely still. Even the birds had fallen silent, as though the lane itself were holding its breath. Behind her she heard the faint creak of the door closing, slow, deliberate, and then the quiet click of the latch. She stood for a moment on the path looking back. The windows glowed faintly in the fading light, and the wisteria swayed gently in the evening breeze. Its blossoms brushed the sill like a sigh, a small, private motion that spoke of release. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer about her shoulders. There was, she felt, a kind of stillness that followed confession. Not peace exactly, but the hush that comes before peace, when the heart is emptied of secrets, and the world waits to see what will fill it next. A dog barked in the distance, a gate clicked. The ordinary sounds of the life returned, and the spell broke. Miss Marple turned away and began her walk home, her step measured, her thoughts quiet but not untroubled. Twilight deepened as she walked along the lane, the soft light gathering in the hollows of hedges and under the eaves of cottages. The air was scented faintly with damp earth and the last breath of wisteria. Miss Marple walked slowly, reflecting as she often did after such days, on how curious it was that evil, when one truly examined it, so rarely wore a villain's face. More often, it was simply fear disguised as duty, love soured by jealousy, or loneliness driven to desperate acts. Humanity, she thought, was infinitely frail, and infinitely forgivable when understood. At the gate of her own cottage she paused to look back once more. A single light still glowed faintly at number 4, a trembling flame in the dusk. It might have been an ordinary lamp, or perhaps something older, sadder, and yet more enduring. She smiled to herself, a small, wistful smile. "Forgiveness," she murmured, "is sometimes the only justice left to us." Then she went inside where the kettle awaited her, and the quiet ticking of her clock resumed its faithful rhythm, steady, patient, and unafraid of time. Inspector Craddock, arriving early at his office, found an envelope lying squarely in the middle of his desk. It was small, cream-coloured, and addressed in the precise, slanting handwriting he recognised at once. "I think you had better come, dear Inspector." There was no signature, but none was needed. Miss Marple's letters were as unmistakable as her conclusions, both written with old-fashioned clarity and quiet certainty. He read the line again, frowning slightly, for there was no urgency in it, only the calm finality of a matter already decided. The case at Wisteria Lane had troubled him, not because of its complexity, but because of its humanity. Too much grief and too little evil, if such distinctions could ever be made. As he folded the letter into his pocket, he thought, not for the first time, that Miss Marple's notion of justice did not always align with the laws, yet it had a way of leaving people gentler, if not always happier. He sighed, reached for his hat, and prepared to walk down to number 4, to close a case that, somehow, felt less like an ending than an understanding. Mrs. Linton was waiting in her chair by the fire when they arrived. She wore a shawl about her shoulders, though the day was mild, and beside her stood a small table with a single candle flickering despite the daylight, a fragile, unnecessary flame. Miss Marple sat opposite her, knitting with quiet patience, as though her presence were not that of a witness, but a companion. The air in the room was heavy with stillness, broken only by the faint rhythm of wool sliding against needles. Craddock paused on the threshold, hat in hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Linton," he said gently. She looked up with a faint smile. "You received her note, then?" "Yes. Miss Marple thought it best that I come." Mrs. Linton's gaze moved to the fire. "I suppose you must, though there is little to tell that the years have not already punished." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "We are not here to accuse, my dear, only to understand." Craddock said nothing. He took the chair Miss Marple indicated and waited, as though one might wait for the last page of a long and sorrowful story to turn itself. The fire crackled faintly. Outside, a blackbird sang somewhere in the lane, a gentle, ordinary sound that made the silence within seem even more fragile. It took time before Mrs. Linton spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not much louder than the ticking of the mantel clock. "I was so certain of my rightness then," she began, "so certain that love, when threatened, must defend itself at any cost. I see now how foolish that was, and how proud." She paused, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Elsie was only a girl. I had misread everything. Her kindness, her youth. I thought she mocked me, pitied me even. When I saw her with Edward that night and the way she tried to comfort him, I lost myself. I remember the sound of her cry, the way she fell, and the silence afterwards. That silence. It never left me. Miss Marple's hands were still. I told him she had gone away, Mrs. Linton continued. He wanted to search for her, but I begged him not to. The war was beginning. Men had their duty, women were to be patient and keep faith. And so I buried her there, beneath the wisteria. It seemed almost merciful then, the flowers covering what I had done. Her voice trembled. But nothing is covered forever. Each spring it returned. The scent, the colour, the reminder. I told myself the candlelight would atone, that the dead might forgive if the living remembered. But the candle brought no peace, only truth, inch by inch, until even silence became unbearable. She looked toward Miss Marple, her eyes hollow yet relieved. Now you know. Miss Marple inclined her head, as though she had known for some time but waited for the soul, not the words, to confess. Inspector Craddock sat very still. He had listened to many confessions in his time, some violent, some cold, most self-justifying. But this was different. There was no need for questions, no desire for defence. It was not a confession to the police, but to conscience itself. He took out his notebook, opened it, and then quietly closed it again. There are some matters, he said, that no law can properly weigh. The years have done what judgment never could. Mrs. Linton looked at him with gratitude that was almost childlike. You mean you will not? He shook his head. No. I think, madam, we shall leave this one to God, and to Miss Marple, perhaps. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. I should say, she murmured, that forgiveness has been quietly at work for some time now. Craddock rose. Then my duty is done, he said softly, though I dare say it never truly began. He left them by the fire, 2 women, one knitting, one weeping, as the little flame on the table flickered in quiet agreement. Evening fell gently over Wisteria, Lane. The sky turned the pale colour of faded silk, and a mist crept up from the meadows. In number 4, the curtains were drawn, and a single lamp burned near the window, a small, steadfast glow that villagers passing by later remembered. By morning, Mrs. Weatherby had heard it first. Gone in her sleep, she whispered over the garden hedge. Peaceful, they say, like someone who'd waited only to tell her story. The news travelled quickly but quietly, with the subdued reverence of people who feel that something solemn has occurred, though not tragic. No one spoke of the past. They spoke instead of kindness, of gentleness, of how Mrs. Linton had always been a bit touched by sorrow. When Miss Marple came later that afternoon, she found the house strangely at rest. The air smelled faintly of lavender and ashes. On the table beside the chair was the small candle, burned down to a pool of wax. She looked once around the silent room, then drew the curtains back a little. The garden beyond was full of wisteria, pale, swaying blossoms catching the light. The ghost at number 4, it seemed, had at last gone to sleep. A few days later, Miss Marple stood in her parlour, dusting as she always did on Thursdays. The cracked teacup bearing the faint initials EC caught the light upon the mantelpiece. She lifted it carefully, turning it in her hand, and smiled. Not sadly, but with the calm affection of one who understands how frail both love and judgment can be. She polished the cup gently, her thoughts meandering. There had been right and wrong in the matter, certainly, but they had grown together like the roots of the wisteria, inseparable now, each shaping the other. So much of life, she reflected, depended on small errors. A word misheard, a feeling misread, a moment of pride mistaken for principle. People were good, mostly, only their fears betrayed them. She set the cup back in its place, straightened the lace runner beneath it, and returned to her chair. Her knitting needles gleamed softly in the afternoon light, as constant and forgiving as time itself. Spring came early that year. The lane filled once more with the scent of earth and blossoms, and the wisteria at number 4 burst into bloom, a cascade of pale lilac that seemed, to those who passed, both sorrowful and serene. Miss Marple, walking with the vicar's wife, paused by the gate. The air was sweet with fragrance, the sky high and clear. "Strange how peaceful it seems now," said the vicar's wife. "After all that talk of hauntings," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The dead never truly haunt us, my dear. Only what we refuse to understand." The other woman looked thoughtful. "And do you think she has found peace?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied. "I believe she found it the moment she ceased to fear the truth." They walked on slowly, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Behind them, the wisteria stirred lightly in the breeze, its blossoms drifting down like pale confetti, soft as forgiveness and just as enduring. The lane was quiet once more, but for Miss Marple the quiet had changed. It was no longer the silence of secrets, but the peace that follows when all has at last been spoken. Spring sunlight filtered gently across Miss Marple's breakfast table, touching the rim of her teacup and glinting upon the silver toast rack. The St. Mary Mead Gazette lay folded beside her plate, its leading article discreetly headlined, "The affair at Wisteria Lane officially concluded." Miss Marple read the paragraph twice, more out of habit than interest. The matter, it seemed, had been settled to everyone's satisfaction, an unfortunate incident from the past, a private sorrow quietly laid to rest. Inspector Craddock was commended for his sensitive handling, the police for their discretion, and the public reminded of the enduring decency of our English villages. She sipped her tea with a faint smile. Already the conversation in drawing-rooms and over garden fences had turned to lighter matters. The upcoming flower show, the vicar's new sermon, Mrs. Price's maid, who had peculiar ideas about dusting. It was ever thus, Miss Marple thought. Life moves forward, tidy and polite, as if grief itself must keep step with the seasons. At the greengrocer's later that morning, conversation bloomed as abundantly as the early daffodils outside. Mrs. Weatherby was there naturally along with Mrs. Pritchard and a few others, all eager to discuss their seedlings, the shortage of good onions and the curious matter of Mrs. Linton. "Poor soul," said Mrs. Pritchard, weighing out new potatoes with excessive care. "So refined, yet so nervous. One forgets what it was all about, really." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, pleased to supply a morsel of recollection. "Something to do with a war tragedy, I believe. Quite sad. Still, she seemed very respectable in the end." Miss Marple, selecting apples with delicate precision, offered no opinion. She merely smiled faintly, observing how swiftly the moral temperature of a story could change once its subject was safely buried. "People do mean well," she thought as she left the shop. "But their memories are like their gardens. They weed out what offends the eye, and what remains soon grows prettier than it ever was." That afternoon found Miss Marple at the vicarage, where Mrs. Haydock had produced an admirable seed cake and an equally admirable sense of purpose. The talk began with bulbs and blight, but soon drifted, as such talks always did, to the subtler weeds of human nature. "It does make one wonder," the vicar's wife mused, pouring tea, "why people take such pleasure in other people's misfortunes. I suppose it gives them a sense of virtue." Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps, though it often comes from fear, it is comforting to believe one would never act so foolishly or cruelly oneself. Yet, loneliness," she added thoughtfully, "has driven many a person to peculiar ends." Mrs. Haydock sighed. "You're always so understanding, Miss Marple. I confess I find it hard to forgive what I cannot quite comprehend." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "That, my dear, is precisely why we must try." They spoke then of smaller things, parish matters, the charity jumble, the vicar's new sermon on humility. But beneath the polite exchange, the echo of the lane's tragedy lingered, soft and persistent as a distant tolling bell. The conversation turned, as it must, to Mrs. Linton. Mrs. Haydock spoke with the cautious reverence one reserves for the recently departed. "It was peaceful, I hear, her passing. I suppose after such unhappiness that is something." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes. Peace when it comes is rarely undeserved. I think she carried her punishment within her all those years, not in fear of discovery, but in knowing herself too well. That is the cruelest of prisons." The vicar's wife was silent for a moment, then said, "You believe she repented?" "Most certainly," said Miss Marple, "but repentance is seldom what people imagine. It is not weeping or confession. It is the long endurance of knowing one has done harm and still trying, day by day, to live rightly thereafter. Mrs. Haydock looked reflective. "You're rather like a theologian, Miss Marple." "Oh, no," Miss Marple smiled, setting down her cup. "Only an observer of habits. And guilt, I have noticed, forms a very consistent one." Outside, the parish bell chimed softly for evening prayers, as though the conversation itself had been a quiet benediction. Later that day, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple walked home along Wisteria Lane. The air was scented with early lilac and the faint sweetness of new grass. Number 4 stood as serene as ever, its garden neat and its windows gleaming in the gentle light. She paused by the gate. The wisteria, heavy now with blossom, draped its tendrils across the fence in fragrant abandon, soft lavender petals swaying in the breeze like the hem of a curtain newly drawn. It was strange, Miss Marple thought, how nature effaces tragedy without malice. The earth, indifferent to sin or sorrow, continues to bloom. And perhaps that, in its way, is mercy, a reminder that life, once confessed to itself, may still be beautiful. She lingered a moment longer, her gloved hand resting lightly on the worn wood of the gate. A sparrow darted from the eaves. The faint hum of bees rose and fell like a quiet hymn. Then she turned toward home, her steps steady, her thoughts clear. Twilight settled softly over St. Mary Mead. In her parlour, Miss Marple sat by the window, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. The clock ticked companionably upon the mantelpiece, and the scent of freshly polished wood mingled with the faint perfume of hyacinths from the garden. Her thoughts, as they so often did, moved gently between past and present, from Mrs. Linton's sad story to the endless small acts of kindness and cruelty that made up village life. Peace, she reflected, is not a gift but a practice, something one must tend like a garden, with patience and humility. Forgiveness, too, must be cultivated daily, lest it wither beneath the ordinary dust of living. She laid her knitting aside for a moment, gazing out into the quiet dusk. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows an owl called. The last light faded upon the lane. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Evil had been faced, sorrow endured, and yet the world went on. With tea to be brewed, neighbours to be comforted, and wisteria soon to fall in petals across the gate. And in that unremarkable continuity she found her answer, that goodness, like her knitting, was never finished, only continued, one steady stitch at a time. Sometimes the most haunting secrets are not those that linger in graveyards, but the ones that bloom again beneath our very windowsills. The affair at Wisteria Lane was never truly about ghosts or crimes. It was about the fragile line between guilt and forgiveness, about how remorse can live longer than life itself. Miss Marple understood, as only she could, that human frailty is rarely wickedness. It is fear, pride, and love, all twisted together like the roots of the wisteria, and in that understanding lies compassion deeper than justice ever could provide. Perhaps that is why the story ends, not with judgment, but with peace, a quiet, moral peace that comes when truth is finally spoken aloud. Because sometimes the dead do not haunt us at all. It is the living who refuse to forgive themselves. But tell me, what do you think? If you had discovered a secret like Mrs. Linton's, would you have exposed it to the world, or let the past rest beneath the blossoms? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe some truths are better left buried, or do they always demand to be unearthed, no matter the cost? If you enjoyed this story from the world of Miss Marple, please consider subscribing for more mysteries filled with quiet suspense, moral reflection, and the secrets of English village life. And if this tale touched you, share it with someone who loves a story where compassion meets conscience. Thank you for listening, and remember, even in the calmest gardens the past may still be blooming beneath the wisteria.